Good afternoon. Welcome to In Conversation with COC and CU webinar event, jointly organized by Commissioner of Charities, Charity Council, Law Society Pro Bono Services, and Singapore University of Social Sciences. My name is Caroline Lim from the S.R. Naden School of Human Development at Singapore University of Social Sciences. I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our conversation today will explore what good governance is for charities, and through case studies that will draw on the expertise and rich experiences of our speakers and panelists, we hope to help you develop best practices in good governance for your charities. The Charity Council defines good governance in the charity sector as the framework and processes concerned with managing the overall direction, effectiveness, supervision, and accountability of an organization. By this definition, governance is integral to the organization performance. And more significantly, good governance is central to gain and retain public's trust. The board of a charity is responsible to instituting and institutionalizing the principles and practices of good governance in the organization. So by the end of this webinar, our goal is for you to have a good grasp of the common governance pitfalls, their legal implications, and sufficient takeaways to further strengthen governance in your charities. We will begin our webinar shortly. And before we do that, do note that materials for today's talk can be downloaded from the Handouts panel on your screen. If you're using a mobile phone or tablet, the icons should appear on your top right-hand corner. On your computer, you should see the icons in the panel on the right. Please download these materials before the end of the talk. Today's conversation is for you, so feel free to ask any questions during the webinar using the question mark icon on your screen. We will be able to see the questions and we will do our best to address them during the panel discussion or before the end of the webinar. For information, this webinar event is being recorded. Now, let me introduce our speakers and panelists today. This afternoon, we are privileged to have with us Mr. Desmond Chin, the Commissioner of Charities, Dr. Gerard Ee, Chairman of the Charity Council, Mr. Gregory Vijayendran, Chairman of Law Society Pro Bono Services, Associate Professor Jennifer Ang, Director of Center for University Core, SUSS, Mr. Abdul Hamid Abdullah, Member of Charity Council. You will first hear from APROF Jennifer Ang on the ethics in the business of doing good, and a presentation by Mr. Gregory Vijayendran on selected ethical legal aspects of doing good. The panel segment follows after each of their sharing. I'm honored to moderate a distinguished panel, including Mr. Chin, Dr. Ee, and Mr. Hamid, as well as our speakers. With such a lineup of panel, I remind you to keep your questions and comments coming fast and furious. To start off this webinar proper, Mr. Gregory Vijayendran, Chairman of Law Society Pro Bono Services, will be saying a few words. Greg, please.
Good afternoon, friends. It gives me great pleasure to kickstart this webinar this afternoon on In Conversation with the Commissioner of Charities and the Charities Unit on the theme of good governance. As a community of charity leaders, board members, and management staff, I know that many of us are familiar and we have incised into and imbibed the concepts of mission and vision of a charity. At the risk of oversimplification, mission is what we do, vision is where we go. And although we have mastered that, applied that in our charity settings, not much is said, however, about ethos. ethos addresses not the what question or the where question, but the how question. How do we do good? And there are many questions that spring out of that. Do the ends justify the means? Should we cut a few corners in the interests of the greater good? To name a few. Quoting from Teresa Goh in her maiden publication, Leading for Good, and specifically her chapters on behaviors reflecting ethics, diversity, culture, and decision-making, she says, among other things, and I quote, "To be able to make decisions well is to know what your values are," unquote. And again, and I quote, "People decide on your ethical values by listening to what you say and what you do. That is the behavior you demonstrate. It takes a lifetime to build a reputation, but it takes one misjudgment to topple it," unquote. And there is deep and profound wisdom there, and I would commend the book to you. But just to share very briefly on one dimension involved, the question of people listening to what you say and what you do oftentimes tilts in favor of what you do, and that speaks much louder than what you say. And so that very much goes into the question of ethical values. The second observation on that quote is the issue of reputation management. You know, we all take years to cultivate so carefully the reputation of the charities that we are privileged to steward, but it takes just that one moment of misjudgment, as Teresa reminds us, to topple it. To navigate some of the moral dilemmas we may face as charity leaders, we need a proper understanding of two universal ethical principles. First, consequentialism, which is ethics based on consequences of actions. Secondly, deontologism, which is ethics based on the virtue of the act itself. And to unpack that this afternoon, we have no better person than eminent ethicist, Associate Professor Jennifer Ang of SUSS. And she will touch on, among other things, the trolley paradox. What is that, you may say? No, she's not going to burst out into song like Judy Garland, singing the trolley song and Meet Me in St. Louis. But you will understand the trolley paradox, which is often used in lectures, even in Harvard. We're very privileged this afternoon to work together with the Charity Council, represented by Chairman Dr. Gerard E. and Mr. Abdul Hamid Abdullah, member of the Charity Council. The Council, as you know, as a refresher, aims to fulfill roles of promotion. They promote good governance standards and best practices. They also fulfill the role of enabler. They enable charities and IPCs to comply with regulatory requirements. And thirdly, advisor. The Council advises the Commissioner of Charities on key regulatory issues and significant cases so that the COC can make more informed and robust decisions. We are also deeply proud and pleased to be collaborating with the Commissioner of Charities, and this is the fifth such occasion since the circuit breaker. We had participated in no less than 4 different webinars, the first being on the 20th of May 2020 last year. And although we hit a high watermark of 456 participants, I'm told that our numbers this afternoon actually threaten to outstrip them all. And it's a great honor for us to be collaborating once again. And so, more about the Commissioner of Charities, Desmond Chin. He served as Commissioner of Prisons from October 2016 to 28 September 2020. He was lauded by Home Affairs Minister K. Shanmugam SC for his many years of sterling service in his leadership in prisons, and awarded the Public Administration Medal Gold last year. He joined MCCY on the October 1st last year as the COC designate. To quote his words, and I think this could well be like his very first words as a Commissioner of Charities, according to the report I read, he said, "Our charities, cooperatives, and mutual benefit organizations are important sectors in helping to build caring and cohesive communities. I look forward to expanding on the excellent work of Hak Singh and his team and working closely with our stakeholders and partners to achieve these ends." Well, that is indirect, but now you will have the pleasure of hearing directly from him. I wish you a fruitful, edifying, and an enriching afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. At this moment, let us welcome Commissioner of Charities, Mr. Desmond Chin, to give his opening address. Mr. Chin, please.
Thanks, Caroline and Gregory, for that very warm welcome. I'd just like to say a few words. Thank you for coming today. We are very pleased to have over 500 of you here. Well, Dr. Gerard Yee, Chairman, Charity Council, Mr. Gregory Vijayendran, Chairman of the Law SOC Pro Bono Services, Associate Professor Lim Chi Ching, Dean of S.R. Nathan School of Human Development, SUSS, and ladies and gentlemen, a very warm afternoon to all of you. I'm delighted to welcome more than 500 representatives from both the social and the people sector that are here today at our fourth installment of the In Conversation with the COC series. This is my first In Conversation as the Commissioner. And as Greg has mentioned, I joined the MCCY in October last year. And this will be my 6th or 7th month. Oh. Sorry about that. And this year, we are delighted to have members of the Charity Council, Mr. Gerard Yee, who is the chairman, and Mr. Abdul Hamid, who are with us today. Although I'm not able to meet up with each of you face to face, we are fortunate to be able to connect digitally today to hear from our very experienced speakers who will be sharing their views with us later. I would like to express my deep appreciation to Law Society Pro Bono Services and SUSS for co-organizing this event with my office and together also with the Charity Council. We have seen many charities participating actively in this event over the years, and this is indeed a testimony of their keen interest in running your charities well. In my last 6 months as the Commissioner of Charities, I had visited almost 40 charities thus far. I've been very much inspired by many of you and the work that you do and the deep passion and dedication in which you carry out your mission. You have been exemplary and I've been richly encouraged. Thank you very much for all your contributions. I would like to share with you, if I could, a couple of observations and lessons I had learned from these visits, as well as our most interesting discussions with the boards and the executive teams. I titled the first charity which I had visited called Rising from the Ashes. I visited a residential home just before this Lunar New Year. It was clean and it was orderly. It smelled antiseptically clean as well, but the environment was warm and friendly. Most importantly, as I walked around, I saw that the residents looked very cheerful and they looked well, including those who were semi-ambulant. All of them were engaged. They were bantering with the staff and they had a big smile on their faces. I felt very happy when I saw them. An elderly lady generously gave us some lanterns that she had made from gold-colored packets, and that lantern is hanging in my room today. During our discussions with the executive team, they were proactively peppering us with many questions on the governance evaluation checklist and details for the forthcoming application for the Charity Transparency Award, as well as our Governance Award 2022. I could tell that this charity had prepared their questions way in advance because the finance director was constantly looking at a 555 booklet and the list of the questions before firing off all of them one by one. I also knew that this charity had faced some dire governance issues and the misuse of funds several years ago. But today, they are an exemplary charity and they have won a multitude of awards and they intend to continue doing so. I could not help but ask them how had they resurrected themselves from their difficulties so quickly. The executive director said simply two things. He had and appreciated a highly effective board, and he was very appreciative of his strong executive team. He told us that the board had pointed the charity back in the right direction. They had brought everyone back to focus on its vision and the charitable objectives of the charity. The board had also relooked all their governance structures and systems and their areas of improvements as well, such as their personnel policies as well as their COI policies. The second thing the ED shared was that the charity had appointed, or rather, from what I know, the charity had also appointed a highly capable executive director who then brought together a very competent team that happened to work very well as one. The finance director was very sharp. She asked all the right questions, including the questions that she had no answers to. And so it was clear to me that the internal controls were very tight without being overly onerous. The Corp Comms person had a very clear plan of action for their daily operations, and they also planned for contingencies. They have put in place sound business continuity plans, good risk assessment frameworks, and had clear and honest channels of communication to the public should anything go wrong. So I had two takeaways from this visit. First, boards must set the right vision and direction. Boards must focus its energies on issues of governance. It must establish sound policies and make the right decisions. Decisions that are not just legally correct, but must be also ethically right, which I believe Professor Jennifer Ang will be speaking on later. My second takeaway was this. Charities must hire the right people for their executive teams, and we must make sure that the team can work together as one. A united team with a compelling vision and under the right leadership will do the right thing, as was seen clearly in this charity. Let me now touch on a second example and the conversations we had and my takeaway from the observation of their operations. Let's call this charity number 2, Preparing for the Future. Sometime last month, this charity reached out to us. They had been re-examining their constitution and they realized that if they did not revise it, their charity will soon become obsolete, as it did not allow for proper board renewal nor succession. This charity wanted to ensure that there will be no sectoral interest when forming the charity board and its management team. And they wanted to do this in a fair and transparent manner so that all members will know exactly why it's necessary to change and what exactly was going to happen. They did not intend to hide anything. In March this year, the charity reached out to us to take an independent look at their revised constitution and also to help expedite the amendments. We met them early this month, and we had the most productive 2.5 hours of discussion. When the constitution is finalized, I believe they will have one of the most forward-looking and progressive constitution. The AGM will be held soon, and we wish them all the best. I have two takeaways from this visit, from this very progressive charity. First, this charity is farsighted. They are keeping a constant eye on their future while plugging away diligently each day to deliver their programs to thousands of their members. They are watchful. They have been constantly scanning the horizon for looming threats, and they are taking early action so that they can be ready for the future when it comes upon them. The second thing I took away from this charity is that the board had put the interests of the charity and the good work that it does for its members above all else. This charity was not going to allow any individual nor sectoral interest to prevail at the expense of the charity. Now, this takes great courage and conviction because there will be opposition, but they are prepared to ensure that the right thing gets done and gets done well. So kudos to them. I'm very proud of these two charities that we have visited. Now, as our charities strive to achieve these standards of governance, we would also like the public to recognize the efforts and the good works that you have done in this area. Hence, my team and I are glad to announce that the Charity Transparency and Governance Awards, which was in hiatus last year, will be back next year. My office will share more information with you in the coming months, and I'd like to request for each of you to do one simple thing. Would you please update your contact list in the charity portal so that we can update you and the news can reach you promptly on both the charity transparency as well as the governance awards. I would urge each of you to participate actively in the assessment and to use this opportunity to assess if your disclosure and governance standards are where they should be. Let's take this as a learning journey. It's not necessary that you must win the first time round. If you do, well and good. If you don't, it's also well and good. Because the journey is as important as your destination. Take that first step. We will be with you and we'll help you along. Now, finally, the charity sector plays a critical and essential role in our society. And the COC's office and the Charity Council are here to help you in any way toward the good that you are doing. We want our charities to grow from strength to strength and to fulfill your purpose of serving our communities well. So please reach out to us or to any of us for that matter if you need any help. We'll be more than happy to assist and to come alongside you. I look forward to our discussion later. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Commissioner. We will now invite Associate Professor Jennifer Ang to share with us the ethics in the business of doing good. Prof, please.
Thank you, Caroline. A very good afternoon to everyone. I teach a course on ethical reasoning in SUSS, and in this sharing, I hope to show how ethics can guide our everyday practical reasoning about what is right and wrong in the business of doing good. So to do so, I will first introduce 3 common ethical positions that inform our decisions in moral predicaments and show how these theories, in the context of 2 common issues identified in the Code of Governance, can help us with reasoning towards an ethically considered decision. Before we begin, let us first define ethics. Ethics is a systematic study of concepts and principles involved in practical reasoning about what constitutes good and bad, right and wrong, and how to use these concepts and principles to guide our action and define our values. So let me illustrate this with an example. I will start with a thought experiment that some of us may be actually quite familiar with, the runaway trolley. This is a problem that was first developed by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967, and it has undergone numerous adaptations to include current-day technologies such as driverless cars and drone weapons. I will outline the thought experiment here. Suppose you are the driver of a trolley. The trolley rounds a bend, and there come into view ahead 5 track technicians who have been repairing signal faults. The track goes through a bit of a descent. At that point, you must stop the trolley down the steep slope before it hits the 5 track technicians. You step on the brakes, but realize that the brakes do not work. Now, you suddenly see a spur of the track leading off to the right. You can turn the trolley into it and save the 5 track technicians. But you suddenly realize that there is 1 track technician on that track, and he can no more get off the track in time as the 5 track technicians can. Is it then morally permissible for you to turn the trolley? Most respondents to this trolley problem find that it is morally permissible to turn the trolley down the spur to save 5 lives while sacrificing 1 life. Now, in a slightly different version of the trolley problem, imagine that you are standing on a footbridge over the trolley tracks. In between the approaching trolley and 5 track technicians, and next to you is a stranger who happens to be very large. The only way to save the 5 track technicians is to push this large stranger over the footbridge onto the tracks below where his large body will stop the trolley. Again, is it morally permissible for you to push the large stranger off the bridge? Now, to this version of the trolley problem, those who initially responded that it is morally permissible to sacrifice 1 life in order to save 5 may actually now hesitate because pushing the large stranger over the footbridge is tantamount to killing an innocent person. This tension we experience between conflicting moral requirements is what we term as a moral dilemma or moral predicament. It is a situation where there is a conflict between different moral positions here. In this trolley example, we see in tension between the utilitarian perspective and the duty-based perspective. The utilitarian perspective dictates that the most appropriate action or the correct action is one that achieves an overall greatest good for the greatest number, which in this example means saving 5 lives by sacrificing 1. They argue that saving more lives is a good act, regardless if it means killing 1 track technician or killing 1 large stranger. The other perspective is duty-based ethics. Duty-based ethics asserts that certain actions, such as killing an innocent person, are just wrong, even if they may bring about good consequences. Pushing the large stranger over the footbridge is wrong because it is wrong to harm others, and also because it involves using a person as a means to an end other than for the persons themselves. This ethical position is premised on the fact that when we conceptualize what a human being is, we recognize the fundamental fact that human individuals each have their own needs, their own wishes, and are able to make their own decisions. And this knowledge itself, in turn, demands us to give ourselves the duty to respect their rights and not treat them as objects. We can find these duties enshrined in religious commands or in specific lists of rights, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, there is a third ethical perspective that is not made obvious in this thought experiment, which is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics states that morality comes from an individual's character. A virtuous person will know what to do in an ethical predicament, the right thing to do, in the right way, at the right moment. The actions of a virtuous person would be moral because they are guided by his or her virtuous character and motives. So take, for example, Aristotle. He would think that virtues are understood as the mean between vicious extreme, and a virtuous person is one who balances between their reasons and their desires. For example, courage is a mean between the excesses of rashness and the deficiency of cowardice. Generosity is a mean between the excess of wastefulness and a deficiency of stinginess, and so on. Now, for Confucius, the 君子, or the superior man, is described to behave in certain ways as well, such as being sincere in thought, broad-minded and open, being prudent, benevolent, and acts in moderation, for example. So how do these ethical perspectives guide one in carrying out their duties as representatives who are entrusted to act in the interest of an charity? I will present for discussion 2 examples of common ethical predicaments which the Code of Governance has already provided very useful guidelines to help us with. So to start off first, I'll talk about the conflict of interest. Well, an interest refers to a commitment, an obligation, duty, or goal associated with the role that one has. A conflict of interest, therefore, is a situation that is created when a person is involved in multiple interests, financially or otherwise, while serving one interest could involve working against the interest of another. So take, for example, of a conflict of interest in the following scenario. A close relation of yours is a vendor who has responded to a tender call by your charity. You have an obligation of goodwill towards your close relations, but also a duty in your official capacity in the organization to make decisions that is to its best interests. Now, for a duty-based ethicist, certain actions are simply wrong. Awarding a contract to a relative or a friend who is a potential vendor may compromise the primary duty of a board member from carrying out independent and objective assessment of what is considered to be to the best interest of the charity. One only needs to imagine that if every board member does the same, not only is the charity's interest unprotected, the official capacity that one holds is now being used as a means towards ends that are other than benefiting the charity. A duty-based ethicist will, in this situation, recuse himself or herself from the tender committee, since he or she will not be able to perform his duty or her duty as an objective and independent assessor. Now, for a virtue ethicist, the right attitude to hold in this situation is to balance one's rationality with one's desires. So while it may be desirable to benefit one's close relations, is it a rational choice? By being generous to one's close relations through granting him or her a contract, one may be incurring waste of the charity's resources, such as agreeing to goods and services that may not be essential, but will qualify as an act of generosity towards the vendor. But on the other hand, To award a contract to a vendor just because he or she is providing the cheapest service may also not benefit the organization because the vendor may not meet the full spectrum of service requirements for a cheaper cost. So the rational thing for the virtue ethics is to thus achieve a mean between the two extremes, right? The excesses of generosity and the deficiency of stinginess by focusing on the context of the situation. The context of the situation defines what is the right thing to do in the right way at the right moment. Here, generosity is not the appropriate motivation and gesture, but prudence is. Generosity, such as the act of gifting on special occasion, is a more appropriate gesture to one's close relations, but perhaps less appropriate in business relations. Now, what about the utilitarian who believes that the morally right act is the one that will yield the overall greatest net benefit? Awarding a contract to one's close relations may seem to yield greater benefits than awarding the contract to some other vendor, perhaps because you know how much the contract may help with the survival of his or her business. However, a true utilitarian will also consider the overall and long-term costs and benefits for everyone, the organization, its beneficiaries, the vendor, and yourself. For example, what if the organization comes to have a reputation of exercising preferential treatment to your close relations? The cost here can range from having future non-competitive tender costs to incurring personal reputational risk. Now, with the application of these three ethical positions to an example where a conflict of interest arises, it is now clear how we can now use ethical perspectives to reason through other similar predicaments. Take, for example, why one should not appoint one close relations to be on the same board for the same reason that they may impair yours or their independent decisions in the dealings with the charity, or why one should recuse oneself from making decisions if one has existing or potential financial and material interests that may impair one's objectivity in the discharge of responsibilities to the charity. And finally, why one is a board member should not be involved in setting his or her own remuneration. Now, the common feature of these situations described is that it involves one being in a position to derive personal benefit from actions or decisions that one makes in their official capacity. The conflict is thus between personal self-interest and the duty towards the organization. All three ethical perspectives arrive at the same conclusion, even though they present different reasons for doing so. And that is that the morally right action in these situations is to discharge one's primary duty as representatives, entrusted to act in the interest of a charity. But if one's objectivity and independence is compromised, one should recuse oneself from the decision-making process. This means putting aside self-interest, such as benefiting ourselves or those we know or we like, so that one remains objective and fair in one's judgments, or stepping aside from making decisions in situations where your duty to judge and act fairly is being compromised. From these ethical perspectives, we can now see why certain policies, procedures, and measures are put in place to help us to declare, prevent, and address situations where there is a conflict of interest. I shall now turn to the second area of concern regarding fundraising practices with its related need for transparency and accountability over its operations. Now, in the Code of Governance, it is quite clear that the general principle states that the charity should ensure that its fundraising activities are transparent and ethical. So let us first outline what transparency means. It constitutes being accountable to its donors on what, how, when the funds would be used, and also being prudent when engaging third-party fundraisers. So this will require, for example, keeping accurate records of donations in kind that are received, proper accounting and depositing of all collections received, and also providing accurate advice to donors about the charity, the intended use for the funds, and the value and tax implications of the donations to your donors. And when engaging a third-party fundraiser, the rationale for the engagement and fee arrangement must be approved by the board and disclosed to potential donors as well. Now, setting up procedures and practices that ensures that the management of funds received are transparent is definitely a way to be accountable to your donors and also ensure that the funds go towards the intended goals. And this way, the ethical standards of accountability and integrity are met. Now, ethically, maintaining transparency and accountability demonstrates a respect for donors' right to make informed decisions. So why is making informed decisions considered an ethical concern? So let us take an example. Suppose you have received an email invite to participate in a survey. Now, what information would help you to decide whether to give your consent to participate? Besides the basic information, such as who is conducting the survey, what its findings are for, how you would have been selected, you'll probably want to know other information as well. Now, for example, what type of information they may be collecting, how will they be dealing with your responses, and maybe even your personal details to ensure that they are not leaked, and how your participation may expose you to certain stresses or harm in any way. For example, having to recall some unpleasant memories, or perhaps even run reputational risk. Now, having full knowledge of what the survey entails and how your information and responses will be managed will allow you to arrive at an informed decision. And your eventual participation in the survey will be one where we term as informed consent. However, if you were not presented with the full information, your consent will be considered rather invalid, because you could have otherwise not consented if there was full disclosure of the risk or harm to your participation. Thus, from a duty-based ethics perspective, the respect for one's right to make informed decisions stems from the fact that we have a fundamental duty to treat others as intrinsically valuable and not as one with instrumental value for us. And in a similar way, for charities to respect their donors' right to make informed decisions, charities will have to be responsible in their accounting, what, how, when the funds will be used, especially with regards to how much eventually goes to the intended beneficiaries. Now, it is important to remind ourselves that upholding accountability and transparency can no longer be a good-to-have quality. Today's conscious givers demand more transparency over a charity's operations. Where and how the funds are used, what are the factors hampering the impact of the cause, for example. A modern-day utilitarian movement called effective altruism, influenced by the utilitarian philosopher Peter Singer, is also gaining traction among conscious givers today. Effective altruism is about answering one simple question: how can we use our resources to help others the most? So to answer this, effective altruism employs evidence and careful analysis to arrive at the very best causes to work on. That is, a cause that allows one to do the most with his or her time and money. It thus focuses on how people can achieve a greater impact by first working on the right problems where one can provide a lot of help and uses tested solutions so that one may achieve great impact. So with these expectations, charities need to engage the limited pool of donors and volunteers a little differently now, by showing them how these forms of giving can yield the greatest benefits for the greatest number of beneficiaries. Now, at this point, I would like to close this sharing by turning your attention to another aspect of fundraising activities or volunteerism, which I hope will generate some discussion later. Now, in recent years, the push towards increasing volunteerism and donation has changed the landscape of giving somewhat. The 2018 Individual Giving Survey carried out by the National Volunteer and Philanthropy Centre revealed two interesting findings. First, Singaporeans cited life priorities such as family commitments, health, and financial security as taking precedence over volunteering and donation. Second, Singaporeans perceive that giving should be purely altruistic, requiring sacrifice and effort. So putting two things together, NVPC concludes that we should encourage more micro-giving and match personal interests to different ways of giving in order to change the perception that giving does entail great sacrifice and effort. Now, on another front, just a year before this giving survey was conducted, the Institute of Policy Studies announced its plan to establish a nationwide time banking system. The idea is that if the time spent on caregiving is recognized, it will encourage more to step forward, thereby enlarging the pool of volunteers and caregivers. So in countries such as the US, Switzerland, and Japan that uses various forms of time banking systems, time here is treated as a form of complementary currency to be exchanged for vouchers to use on goods and services, or to be exchanged for cash. There were also initiatives to incentivize donors, such as using prizes to entice and reward donors. The Given Company, a social enterprise, conducted donation online appeals using lucky draws to incentivize donation, with the promise that donors have a chance of winning a Mercedes-Benz. Now, I will at this point say that I'll leave the legislative issues to our expert speaker, Gregory, to fill us in. But I am instead interested to ask, how do ethical perspectives help us discern what is the ethically right way to raise funds or increase volunteerism? Now, admittedly, the idea behind meeting the motivations to give may indeed increase giving, whether it is through aligning one's giving with one's skills or life priorities, or incentivizing through exchanging time for cash or other goods and services, or giving donors a chance to win a desirable prize. These initiatives, however, are primarily utilitarian in nature, by creating a win-win solution that achieves the greatest benefit for the greatest number. But when it comes to matters of doing good for others, or benevolence, should we be motivated primarily by utilitarian calculations? Philosophers and moral psychologists tell us that our moral motivations are multidimensional. We have seen how attractive the utilitarian argument is for incentivizing giving behavior, because it may benefit us somewhat, and even if it does not, it should benefit most people. Duty-based ethicists have another view. They argue that we must be motivated by our sense of duty to humankind because our desires are unreliable, either because our self-interest gets in the way, or we are unable to develop the correct sentiments or emotions towards others to cause us to act. This duty to others stems from the fact that we believe are the rights of a human being according to our conceptualization of what a human being is, as I have shared before. When we imagine someone being deprived of ways to meet their needs, being denied of any means or hopes to fulfill their wishes, and having their rights violated, as a possible predicament that every one of us may face, we would rationally want to make protecting and helping those in need our basic duty as human beings. It is a duty of benevolence that virtue ethicists often speak of as well. We see our kind acts to others as a natural part of our being, not for the benefits it brings, such as social status, special mentions, and awards, but for the very fact that we are doing what we ought to do as fellow human beings. So, doing what a typical philosopher does, I'll end this sharing with a question. What should motivate us to do good to others? Perhaps the fact that we, humankind, animals, and the environment, share a common existential precarity should guide our common sense and emotions towards what is the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
And more significantly, your question, what should motivate us to do good to others, is food for thought, and potentially a question to our panelists in addition to fiduciary duty and public trust. Why good governance matter? We now have Gregory Vijayendran, Chairman of Law Society Pro Bono Services, to share with us on the topic of selected ethical legal aspects of doing good. Gregory, please.
Thank you, Dr. Caroline Lim, and good afternoon again, friends. It's a great privilege to complement the outstanding sharing that we've just heard from Professor Jennifer on the ethical aspects of doing good. And I think it gives us a framework of how to approach this question of ethos that I had flagged at the onset during my welcome remarks. There is a quote I often use when I speak about ethics to our Part B students, who essentially are pre-call and completing their course in order to be called. They used to be known as pupils and now practice trainees. And this quote comes from a book on ethics about how life in the law is an adventure in applied ethics. There is some truth in that statement about an adventure in applied ethics that applies even to the world that we are all accustomed to in the charity sector, because there are ethical judgments that we need to make in the cause of doing good. And the hope is that we steer clear of getting into a misadventure in applied ethics. I'm going to select a few areas in the Code of Governance for Charities and Institutions of Public Character in the course of my own presentation this afternoon. Although in some ways one could describe the code as soft law, it's a comply or explain, it's not hard-coded into legislation or subsidiary legislation, but the principles that are enshrined within are important enough, and in some cases are also buttressed by hard law. For example, in the case of conflict of interest that I will unpack in a moment. So let's start at the very beginning, which is a good place to start, and that is definitions. And so we look at the glossary in the Code of Governance for what constitutes conflict of interest and what or who more precisely constitutes a fiduciary. Conflict of interest, a situation where a board member, staff, or other person with an existing or potential financial or other material interest that might impair his or her independence or objectivity in the discharge of responsibilities and duties to the charity. A fiduciary is a person standing in a special relationship of trust, confidence, or responsibility to another. Board members and staff having the general control and management of the administration of a charity are fiduciaries with respect to the charity they serve, and as such, their responsibilities to the charity are termed fiduciary duties or fiduciary responsibilities. So these are cornerstones or anchors that you need to be acquainted with to internalize and to ensure that you do not stray away from. I would make two observations about the definitions that you see before you. If you look at the definition of conflict of interest, you see there an express reference to an existing or potential financial or other material interest, which touches on actual or potential conflict of interest or COI. So query about a question that has cropped up in some other sectors, which is the issue of the apparent conflict of interest. What if you're not in actual conflict or in potential conflict, but there might be an appearance of conflict, which as definitions go, is where there is a perception or reasonable apprehension, which reasonably well-informed persons could probably have, that a charity trustee's private interests could improperly influence the performance of their duties, even if this is not in fact the case. And I would venture to say that an enlightened approach is also to pay attention to this question of apparent conflict to your stakeholders, externally or internally. And it's not just a question of optics, but foundationally, the definition that we see here focuses on actual or potential conflict. Now, fiduciary is also a very loaded term, and it's important to remind ourselves that for everyone here that is on the board of a charity or an IPC, you are charity trustees. You are in a position of trust. This is a special relationship. You know, these are funds that you are entrusted with. These are assets that you're entrusted with. These are resources that you're entrusted with, and you're a steward over them. And so from definitions, I will now move on to principle 2 on conflict of interest. The general principle, which is known to us who are familiar with the code, is that board members and staff should act in the best interests of the charity. Clear policies and procedures should be set and measures to be taken to declare, prevent, and address conflict of interest. And 3 points can be made straight away about the general principle, the focus on the best interests of the charity and acting in the best interests of the charity, which focuses on the conduct of board members and staff, and that it needs to be examined against the lens of the best interest of the charity. Now, at the same time, you see there in the general principle, clear policies and procedures being referred to. And this is the significance of having documented processes in terms of an express manual or handbook or some policy that focuses on the issue of declaring, preventing, and addressing conflict of interest. And it's not just about having the paperwork, it is also about implementation, because of the reference in the principles there to measures to be taken. And so that's where the rubber meets the road when one encounters situations of conflict and need to manage them. And so if one walks through the principle itself in terms of more granular detail, principle 2, you will see there that there are references to specific paragraphs in the parenthesis. Paragraph 2.1 of General Principle 2, and this applies across the board, whatever tiers you may be in as a charity or as an IPC. And so there are tiers and fears here, whatever the tiers may be that you are slated in, whether basic, intermediate, enhanced, or advanced. And so these are common denominators, and these are basic parameters that apply across the board. 2.1 says that the charity should set in place documented procedures for board members and staff to declare actual or potential conflicts of interest to the board at the earliest opportunity. And so this is the reference I made to the general principle about having documented procedures. And you want to have documented declaration procedures that allow for prevention or avoidance, that essentially make it part and parcel of your SOP for board members and management to preemptively declare relationships to the board. And oftentimes boards do this with filings that are done at the onset of their tenure about the many other boards they serve on, etc. And these are preemptive. And you would see there a reference to at the earliest opportunity. So this forms an alert. It could be a safety net in some cases for the eagle-eyed in case there is a lapse of memory on the part of a particular board member. And so these processes help to prevent or avoid. But preventing and avoiding, of course, catches the problem way ahead of time before it becomes a tsunami. What happens when there is an actual COI? And so here you have got paragraph 2.3, that there should be special procedures to deal with the conflict of interest when board members have, and 3 examples are cited, an interest in business transactions or contracts that a charity may enter into, any interest or other organizations that a charity has dealings with or is considering entering into joint ventures with, or any interest in the charity's suppliers, service users, beneficiaries, or staff. And you can see how multifaceted this is. It's not just referring to the vendors, but also to strategic partners and also to the beneficiaries and to staff. And so you need to have procedures to deal with this. So this is dealing with actual conflict as and when they pop up in the course of a charity's work. Now, there are some specific examples. These are cited in paragraph 2.4, and that's my next bullet point, which could be the counsel of prudence to apply when you are actually managing a conflict of interest, or COI. So when a conflict of interest, for example, arises at a board meeting, what should the board member do? Number one, and you've heard this also from Prof. Jennifer earlier, there is the aspect of recusal from the meeting proper. So for example, if there is an extraordinary meeting called that deals with the issue of a tender, to be awarded, or a contract to be entered into, then it would be wise for the board member to steer clear of that meeting completely and to recuse completely from the meeting. So you recuse from a meeting. And then the other option is where, for example, that may be one of many items in the board agenda, and so the board member will not participate in the discussion. In some cases, they will leave the meeting and rejoin the meeting after the discussion is over. In some cases, they keep mum, they say nothing at all. In some cases, they zoom in, zoom out. Of course, those are for online meetings. And so those are examples of non-participation in the discussions. And it would be prudent to have that recorded in the meeting minutes. And of course, critically, the board member in question who faces the issue of conflict of interest should abstain from the voting. And so they should not vote on the matter. This is obvious, because you really do not want that to taint the ultimate decision, even if the decision may be justifiable independently of that vote. And again, the Council of Prudence is to have that fact recorded in the minutes as to how the final decision is made on the transaction or the contract. These are very wise, straightforward, practical solutions that are proffered in paragraph 2.4 of the Code of Governance. And then in paragraph 2.5, to round up this particular slide, the appointment of staff who is a close family member of a current board member or staff entails proactive declaration of relationships. So that's my phrase, proactive declaration. The Code of Governance itself makes a reference to declaration of such relationships. And then it goes further to elucidate the principle. And the principle is that you should not influence decisions made during these procedures. So the individual concerned, whether board member or staff, should not influence the decisions. So from the examples that one could think of that might constitute influence, this would be illustrated by undue influence, for example, or even some kind of duress in the decision-making process. And you want to steer clear of that, where it involves a close family member of the current board member or staff who is being appointed to staff. Some charities, IPCs, have HR committees who would then, make the decision or make the recommendation accordingly. And that could often be also a safeguard for some of these types of situations. And from the walkthrough that I had of Principle 2 and the various paragraphs there, you could see how there is a sharp distinction between declaring, preventing, and addressing, but these are essentially the facets you need to pay attention to. Basically, declaring a conflict of interest, knowing about the conflict of interest, certainly, and abstaining from decision making. So those are some practical points to remember. Now, I had said earlier that some of the principles are actually buttressed by statute. And so one example of it is the Companies Act. The Companies Act, which obviously is the underlying regime applicable to companies limited by guarantees, as some of the charities that you are stewarding are structured as, you need to be aware of Section 156 of the Companies Act. And this posits a disclosure obligation at the board level. And certainly, this is an example of something that has been hard-coded in statute on pain of criminal sanctions. And one of the illustrative cases here is the case of Yo Gek Singh and public prosecutor, decided in year 2000 by our former Chief Justice Yong Pang Hao. In that case, which is an instructive case as well, the former Chief Justice observed that the disclosure obligation in Section 156 of the Companies Act does not apply where the director's interest consists only of his being a member or creditor of a corporation which is interested in a transaction. And so, so that might be a saving grace if you're just a member per se or a creditor of that corporation which has an interest. But the interest involved must be properly regarded as not being a material interest. And Chief Justice Yong Pang Hao, as he then was, observed three things. Number one, that a director's interest need not be a personal one. Number two, it suffices as long as the director involved may be considered to be directly or indirectly interested in the contract. So you also have an element of indirect interest. Number three, that it doesn't matter that the company involved suffered no loss or the director made no gain, because that section is a penal section. So it actually posits criminal consequences. You don't have to show loss on the part of the charity. So you can see that this actually imposes a very stringent obligation on the part of directors that you can't take lightly or take for granted. COI has cropped up in a number of cases that we've seen. I won't go into names, I won't go into examples. I think they're very familiar to us. Some of the high-profile cases have all involved COI, and from experience as well, this is one of the issues that actually arises again and again in practice, sometimes involving a family member, sometimes involving situations where people are tripped up because they're just not alert or sensitized to this. I'm going to move on very quickly in the remaining time I have to disclosure and transparency and also fundraising practices. So fundraising practices very quickly. I'll touch on this. It's just one slide. And I'll be very brief. The general principle involved is Principle 7. The charity should ensure that the fundraising activities are transparent and ethical. It should account to its donors on what, how, and when the funds should be used. The charity should also be prudent in engaging third-party fundraisers. You've already heard from Professor Jennifer earlier about this particular principle. And in the context of conduct of fundraising, paragraph 7.1.1, the charity should ensure that its fundraising activities will preserve the integrity and transparency of the charity. And so essentially transparency has already been unpacked in the presentation that preceded mine. And you already know that that requires you to be very open about the what, how, and when the donations are used, and to be especially conscious of that and accountable to your donors. And certainly when it comes to designated donations, you need to have that extra layer of accountability because of the ring-fenced nature of the donations, which may require you to take on the special duties as far as disclosure and transparency are concerned to those donors. An example on integrity. What does it mean by preserving the integrity of the charity? And this comes from my previous work leading a charity called Club Rainbow. I can be open about this. I think in the early days, even though Club Rainbow had to struggle along as a charity in its early days, the temptations were there to actually use a little bit of half-truth if we were so minded to say that the work was not just about chronic and life-threatening illnesses, but also to slip in the words terminally ill. But I was very firm that we would not mislead our donors, we would not mislead our stakeholders. Yes, if I had put in the words terminally ill in some of our presentations, yeah, we might have tugged at heartstrings, but that would have been dishonest, and it would have flouted this principle of the integrity of the charity. You have to be true and authentic about what your charity is doing and what it is not doing. Now, final points on disclosure and transparency, and I'm going to breeze through the next set of slides in the interest of time, because I'm sure we all want to be enlivened and enriched by the Q&A from the distinguished panel. So disclosure and transparency, and so here we know that certainly the annual report, should make available to stakeholders information on program activities, audited financial statements, board members, and executive management. And this is principle 8. We can go on to the next slide, where in the case of even remuneration of your 3 highest paid staff, it should be disclosed, and if none of the staff receive more than 100,000 in annual remuneration, the charity should disclose this fact. And then next slide, you see that in the context of the enhanced and of course the advanced tier, there is another layer of governance where the charity must disclose the number of paid staff who are close members of the family of the executive head or board members and whose remuneration each exceeds 50,000 during the year, and also that there is disclosure of the staff's remuneration itself. Also on principle 8, as applicable to the enhanced and the advanced tiers, which would apply to a subset of the audience here. Let's move on to the next slide. This touches on the whistleblowing policy. The charity should disclose in its annual report whether it has a whistleblowing policy. The board should review the policy and arrangements by which staff of the charity and any other persons may in confidence raise concerns about possible wrongdoing or improprieties in financial or other matters within the charity. The board's objective should be to ensure that arrangements are in place for such concerns to be raised and independently investigated, and for appropriate follow-up action to be taken. And it's paragraph 8.6 and applicable to the enhanced and the advanced tier. Now, in some cases, I can understand the inertia on the part of board management not to be entirely enthused about a whistleblowing policy. But I want to offer a fresh take on it, that actually the whistleblowing policy, as recommended here by virtue of paragraph 8.6, is a silver lining for the charity. In a few examples, and in the last 6 months, I've had to advise on at least 2 charities where complaints surfaced as a result of a whistleblower. Now, if that whistleblower did not have the avenue or access to a whistleblowing policy and a mechanism to whistleblow within the charity, because of that lack of redress, it's entirely plausible that the complainant or whistleblower might have just escalated it externally. Now, of course, there will be cases where it's egregious enough, it needs to be the subject of an appropriate report to the Commissioner of Charities, police report, and that should continue to be the case in terms of potential redress for matters that are appropriate. But there are also very many matters that can be right-sized and properly the subject of the domain of the board. And if the avenues are created, whether to the audit committee, audit and governance committee, or through a private reporting line that goes to the board, then some of the issues that would be quite properly the subject of inquiry by the board themselves. The assumption, of course, is that the board members themselves are not tainted or the subject of that complaint. And of course, if anyone is, then they need to be segregated, be quarantined, as it were, from the rest of the board for the purposes of that inquiry. But it could be properly right-sized and then properly analyzed, and then the appropriate steps taken by the board, as is the case for some charities that are enlightened enough to have a whistleblowing policy. And so this is one way that some of the ethical concerns that may arise in charities could also be sensibly dealt with by the charity. So I conclude now with the last 2 slides, And I will leave you with the wise words published by the Charity Council on 2nd September 2019. How interesting, before COVID hit, before circuit breaker happened, we have these wise words on building the ethics infrastructure of your charity. And here we are. Now, and I'll quote, and let me just read to you. Some charities use a code of conduct to encourage ethical and moral behavior in its staff and volunteers, while others use regular dialogues and reminders to create behavioral awareness. Although codes of conduct are effective in communicating standards of behavior to staff, they must be supported by a robust ethics infrastructure. And then next slide. Ethics infrastructures include training, active monitoring of staff compliance, and protection for staff who blow the whistle on unacceptable behavior. An ethical infrastructure must also be embraced by your board of directors and management in order to support an ethical culture within the organization. Charities that are serious about fulfilling their mission and vision must continue to meet the behavioral expectations of their stakeholders in terms of ethical behavior. I can do no better than to echo those wise words from the Charity Council for you to reflect on and to apply even within your own charity. Thank you.
Thank you, Gregory. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Moving on, we will be having the panel segment with our distinguished panel. We noted some questions from the audience. Please keep them coming. On the panel with me are Commissioner of Charities, Mr. Desmond Chin, Chairman, Charity Council, Dr. Gerard E, Member, Charity Council, Mr. Abdul Hamid, SUSS Associate Professor Jennifer Ang, and Chairman, Law Society Pro Bono Services, Mr. Gregory Vijayendran. Let me begin with the first question, and I thought nothing better than to start with why good governance matter in addition to the board fiduciary duties as well as public trust. And I'm sure our audience are eager to hear from Dr. Gerard E as well as Mr. Abdul Hamid. Maybe we could start with Dr. E.
Whoops. Yeah. Corporate governance,
Yes, we can hear you.
Is a very broad subject, and it covers a whole set of processes that if bulk of it is in place, then you are protected in the sense that things won't go horribly wrong. And that itself is something that will guide you on your daily practices, on the things you do, how you go about doing things itself. Without governance in place, with so many things happening in our operations, it's very easy to trip up. So if you have a governance process that involves, say, for example, internal controls, then you know the way you manage your processes itself will be checked. There will be check and balances, and that if anything should go wrong, it will not be some major, or it will be easily identified and addressed. Without that, to just go on goodwill itself is a non-starter, because you cannot be mindful of everything that's happening all the time. And especially the bigger the organization, you have so many people there, you have to make sure that you have this set of guidance and rules that everyone is aware of and everyone observes. And that's the reason why we need to have it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. E. Perhaps we could hear from Mr. Hamid.
Hello, good afternoon. I'd like just to mention about the word governance is quite a loaded term. It means different things to different people. And I find that in the course of my interaction with charities and people, they are confused between governance and management. These are the two key terms related, but they need to be separated. So the governing board should be separated from those who are managing or executing the board strategy. I would liken the role of the governing board like steering a ship towards a particular destination. That ship is by captain, and you'll have to see that the interests of the stakeholders, the needs of the stakeholders are met. So in this case, will be the beneficiaries of the charities, the state organizations, and the governing boards are those who actually lay down the broad parameters, something like the lawmakers put out the policies and so forth. And they should not, in a way, in my personal view, get too much involved with the management or at the operational side. Very often, these two are not segregated, and that's where the problem lies in terms of conflict of interest situation would arise. I would say that the importance of governance is that it is important to manage the risks. And one of these risks is not just a risk of compliance with the relevant laws and regulations or code of governance, but the risk in which they have to manage are those obstacles or inhibitors that actually block their achievement of the business objectives or the organizational objectives. So I think good governance is basically common sense. Without good governance, actually the stakeholders will not have the necessary confidence and trust in the organizations, because the governing boards are those people whom they have entrusted with their resources to steer the organization to do what is right in the best interest of the stakeholders or beneficiaries.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So having in place the policies and procedures, a clear understanding of what governance is for different members, whether it is for the board as well as for management staff, and a definition of the roles and responsibilities, a clear segregation of duties. Thank you very much. I have another question here. That is for any one of you who would like to take the question. This pertains to staff costs, right? And this question reads, what is a good gauge of annual staff costs of the charity versus the annual income? I've heard some say that it should be 20%. I've also heard that in Singapore, there are some charities where the percentage of staff costs is 60 to 70% of income. Can you advise? We have a distinguished panel of expertise here. Yes, Dr. E wants to take the question first.
No, I think you have to understand the different type of costs. There are certain charities that provide direct services, and a lot of these costs are involved in the provision of direct services. So for example, if you're running a nursing home, your direct services will include the hiring of nurses or people who sanitize the place. So this will be very high cost, and it's part and parcel of keeping the operations in order. Then you have the administrative cost. That's the one that people struggle with. Is it 10% or 20%? And we have a legacy thing for all these decades, especially among donors. They are fixated that administrative costs should not exceed 10%. And I think this is a contributory factor to why many charities are not better run. Especially now, operations are getting more complex. The adoption of IT, you cannot make it work if you don't spend more in the back room to make sure your IT systems are working, is up to grade, that you have, more importantly, the appropriately qualified staff. So in trying to survive on 10%, some charities, especially in keeping their accounts, they just get anyone that has some rudimentary knowledge of accounts, hire them because it's affordable, it's cheap, and they end up with a messy set of accounts. So I think this needs to be addressed. In my personal view, my greatest wish is for the donors or the various stakeholders to accept that it should be at least 20%. And in some cases, if it's really complex and it requires a lot of IT infrastructure to collect data so that proper analytics can be done, so that better policies and programs can be developed, then it may well exceed 20% and go up to 25%. Adopting IT is not going to be cheap. All of us, especially during COVID-19, has been forced into accelerating in the adoption of IT. And we know at the front end, with all the grants, all the assistance, we have gone out to buy the hardware, only to discover there is an annual maintenance cost. How are you going to fund that with your 10%? I'm not so sure. And it's an ongoing cost. And then there is the cost of upgrading your software on a regular basis. So my view, minimally, I hope all stakeholders accept that it should be at least 20% for medium and larger charities.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yee. Mr. Chin, Commissioner, would you like to add to this? You have seen a lot of charities.
Well, it's only been 6 months, but I've seen a few. I actually had this conversation with Dr. Gerard Yee some weeks back, and he made this same point. I guess the key is will rest with the donors, because the donors' appetite for how much they would like to see their money go directly to the beneficiary. And you and I know that for most donors, if given a choice, they would like 100% of it going to the beneficiary directly. But that is not possible, as so adequately explained by Dr. Yee. So I think what the charities will need to do is really to educate donors as to what they need, and exactly what has mentioned by Dr. Yee. If you want to run a good charity, you will have to invest in some of these necessary expenses, whether it's IT or it's paying staff better, so you get a good quality staff, investing in a good person in finances so that he doesn't mess up all the accounts, and then we get all sorts of scraps later on. Yeah, so I think the charities, what they can do is really to educate their donors to understand that there is an administrative cost, but they will not use it foolishly. They're actually stewards of the public money, and therefore good governance is required for it.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Dr. Caroline, if I may hijack a little bit of the time, because Gregory and Professor Jennifer has brought up very important subject on the question of ethics, and also on the subject of conflict of interest. There's one perspective I hope observers will pay attention to, especially if they are board members. And I see this over the last 30 years. If you're a board member and the question of fiduciary duty to discharge it, if you see something that is not going right in your charity, you are not discharging your duty by resigning and pretending you didn't know anything. Once you are on board, you have a fiduciary duty to discharge, and it's a moral obligation to act on it. You can blame it on your hard luck for having decided to join the board, but once you're on the board, you have that duty, not just a legal duty, but a moral duty to discharge. So please don't think resigning, going away and pretending nothing has happened, you are okay. It is not okay. It's not good for the community, nor for the charity.
The responsibility is larger in a non-profit, in a charity sector.
Yeah, I had to say this because I know that nobody's going to raise this question, but I think it's important enough.
Thank you. Thank you. Jennifer and Greg, would you all like to add to this?
Go ahead, Jennifer. Ladies first.
Sure. Thank you. Well, I think for a philosopher or ethics, I think the biggest problem that we have to deal with really is a weakness of will, I think most of the time we know what is the right thing to do. The problem is following through with that. And as humans, I think we are fallible, and we do suffer from the fact that we lack moral courage. So when we teach ethics, building, I like what Gregory mentioned when he ended off his talk, when he talks about the ethics and as a culture in the organization is important. Well, we need to continuously not only remind, I've seen, giving our students lessons, for example, in ethics is one way of helping them to reason through different positions and understand what conflicts are. But at the end of the day, it's the practice that matters. And to have that practice, I think you need to have an environment that encourages moral courage to shine, and not penalize. So when Gregory talked about whistleblowing, I think that is highly important because it does build a certain kind of culture that whistleblowers do have, that their moral courage is being encouraged in a way, or being built up by that culture, for them to be able to speak up when they see that things are wrong before it gets bigger or before it gets blown up. So I think practically that's one way organizations can help themselves. But I know as individuals, that moral courage is always that problem. It's easy to know what's the right thing to do, but it's very, very difficult to actually do the right thing.
Well said.
Well said
Greg.
indeed. And yeah, I mean, I echo, what Dr. Gerard E. and Prof. Jennifer have offered. I think this aspect that Prof has touched on, which is moral courage, is critical. And I'm very glad that Dr. Gerard E. as well made that clarion call for board members who do see something wrong to have, the gumption, to have that cognizance of your own duty or fiduciary duty at the forefront of your minds, and to say or do the right thing. Having an ostrich approach, Nelsonian blindness, closing your eyes to what is happening, I think is highly irresponsible. I think none of us want to stare at a crisis or see a ship. And I think that wonderful analogy that Abdul Hamid shared with us, he was steering that ship, you see it nearing an iceberg. It's not the time to go and start jumping off the ship, onto a lifeboat. I think we have to speak up. Use the channels that are there, and speak up, because it involves public funds. And you are there as a custodian and as a trustee. And so I think the wise words that Dr. Gerard E. has put forward should be borne in mind. I know it's messy. I know it's going to take time. You may not be liked, you may not be popular, but that's the right thing to do. It's not about our individual interest. It's about doing the right thing.
And this discussion answers the next question I was going up to ask earlier on, which says, is it necessary to wait for something to go wrong? Clearly no, right? Stand up with courage and do the proper, or facilitate the proper investigation and recourse to be taken. Okay, so I hope we've answered this question rightly and squarely. Now, let me move on to the next question. Now, this has got to do with board succession planning. Boards do play or do rely on the skills and knowledge of individual board members. Some boards may have little experience with charity governance, in particular those for IPCs, which can be quite specialized and different from governance of enterprises. How could it be made clearer to board members of the huge responsibilities that they have on their shoulders? Maybe we want to hear from the Commissioner.
I think, thanks, Caroline. I think this is not the first time I've heard this. Just to share, my wife was recently invited to sit in a board of sorts in a charity area, and so she asked me, "Yeah, is there an onboarding exercise for charities? Because I have no idea what I'm supposed to do." And so I told her, "Well, there is. You can go CNPL. You can go to SID. You have also, I think, put board, right?
SUSS.
SUSS, and a whole gamut of the whole bunch of people you can go to get some help." And then she said, "Okay, thank you very much." But this is exactly the point. I think sometimes when we pick people for boards and we pick them for their specific expertise, that's a good thing to do. But they also need to understand their overall responsibilities for being in the board in totality. So their fiduciary duties, it is not, and they really need to set the proper direction and for the executive team to work on. So I think it's okay if your board members are, well, it's ideal if you can pick board members who are ready to go, but that is not always possible. So for board members who need some onboarding, there are avenues for which they can go and get help too, and you should actively send them to those areas for help. And of course, attend all the webinars in the charity portal that they can go to and listen to experts like Dr. Yi, Hamid, Gregory, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone? Yes, yeah.
To add
Go on, please.
from my experience with the number of charities, there is very little investment by board members on training. Hardly, in fact, in my Malay Muslim community, for instance, I was quite actually starkly find that there is not many board members for training and the kind of support. I think this is something which you need to communicate better in terms of the messaging. That if you're on the board and you may have the expertise in certain areas, but you need to be trained in various aspects of your duties as a director of a company or a board members. Must find time to invest in training. Otherwise, you will not be able to discharge your responsible duties and responsibility effectively.
Yes.
Well, I think, Dr. Caroline, I think the COVID-19 has accelerated changes in the way we manage our organizations, especially a greater use of IT and so forth. It is very timely now that board needs to look at renewal and ensure they have sufficient diversification, especially all charities now trying to cope with IT data. Do they have board members that actually understand the processes, or are they just dependent on what they hear various consultants propose to them, and how do they then make decisions with the lack of knowledge? And it's timely that they have to see whether among their board members they have anyone that actually has the knowledge. Secondly, especially in charities that deals with social service, and in almost every instance involves the family, I always wonder how effective is an all-male board in discerning about matters relating to the family. Can they really understand or have empathy for what the woman in the family goes through? How do they juggle with being a wife, executive, a mother, and so forth? So it's timely that we have to look at the composition of board, have board renewal, and have diversification. And having said that, I mean, I have a lot of peace. I really, the reason why I enjoy this work is I think there's a lot of things we need to change. You know, this thing about renewal and 10 years renewal, and I always hear the argument, oh, but you know, he's the founder of the organization, so we cannot dismiss him. But if the organization is so dependent on one person, what happens if a bus runs over the individual? Is it the demise of the organization? Surely it cannot be. So where is the validity in the argument that because he's the founder, he's the passion behind it, he must remain forever? Is there such a thing as forever? Are we sure this person is going to be around anyway? And when should anything happen to the individual, what happened to the organization? So I think succession planning needs to be done more maturely, and people really need to question this thing about anyone being so indispensable.
Thank you.
If I could add to
Thank you,
that,
Dr. E.
Yeah,
please.
If I could add to that, I think that's a wonderful question for us to reflect. Is there such a thing as forever? I think we need to remember that the institution is always larger than any individual, including the founder. And I think that has to be something that we need to be cognizant of, no matter how charismatic, how strong the personality of the founder is, no matter how much that founder has given their life to the cause. And you can also take it from me, I've served in a charity for close to 20 years, so I understand some of the issues involved. I'll make two more points. One of them is based on a resource that is available and that you would do well to also read. It's the guide, the board appointment guide for charities, which is a wonderful read. It's not too heavy or voluminous, and this guide from the Council for Board Diversity, collaborating with the Singapore Institute of Directors, and I believe Dr. Gerard he is also involved in that, has got a number of good chapters that you would really learn from, including number one, what is the role of the board? Number two, how to best compose your board. Number three, how to nominate and appoint your next board member. Number four, how to optimize your board effectiveness through board culture and dynamics. And then number five, what boards can do to attract new members. And I'll leave you very quickly with 2 practical points drawn from my own journey. And that is, I think the need to be intentional. For succession planning, you have to be intentional. If that means appointing, the successor to the committee or to a vice chair role to shadow the existing members, then that's how you do it. Induct them in. Don't throw them into the deep waters of the pool for starters. So that intentionality is critical, and the practicality would be, committees, vice chair role, or as a shadow, or perhaps even as an alternate. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you for that. There is a related question about succession planning and board renewal, and that's in one of the later questions, and I thought it's appropriate for me to bring it up at this juncture. We see some charities, especially in arts charities, where the executive director is also the board chair. What are your views on this?
I'm assuming that you're asking me the question.
Go on.
Please correct me if I'm wrong. If I said, I think there is. I think it is possible, but you need to ensure a few things. One, there must be board independence. That means you cannot have so many people on that board such that an independent decision on how the charity is to be run and cannot be made. Secondly, if you are ever both the executive director and the board chair, then obviously you cannot dictate how much you have to be paid and all sorts of remuneration that is related to you, because there'll be a clear conflict of interest. If there's any remuneration discussions and so on and so forth with regard to your salaries, and then you should step out and not be involved in it at all.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner.
Maybe
Dr. E?
I think what the Commissioner says is very important, but I'm also mindful of smaller charities where there's just a handful of people who got together driven by the same passion. And usually there's one leader that provides the fire and the passion behind it. And because they're so small, almost everybody is involved in the work. And there's really no clear distinction as to in terms of executive role. So the chairman and all board members are really roll up their sleeve and they're all involved. So I can picture such a situation, and I know I have friends who are in the arts group, and usually they're quite small and driven by a lot of passion. But as the Commissioner has just said, there are certain governance rules that you are advised to follow so that you don't create misperception that you are mismanaging your organization itself. The smaller you are, and when everyone is involved in decision making, everyone rolling up the sleeve, all the more so it's important to make sure you have very transparent governance in place, so people who want to support you know that in spite of your circumstances, you are okay to support because you have proper rules and regulations.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. E. It's unusual for us to have a philosopher. Yeah, I was going to invite Jennifer, but Greg, you go first. Yeah. So Jennifer will prepare. Yeah. Yes, Jennifer, maybe you want to go first? What are the ethical considerations in such a scenario where you have the same individual wearing the hat of the executive director as well as the board chair? So executive role and the governance role.
Well, I will call this a moral predicament on a daily basis. And definitely is not something that is pleasant to deal with, because I think at a workplace, you do need, for sanity's sake, to have a clear role and definition of responsibilities that you're in charge of. But in this situation, definitely these roles and responsibilities are going to come into conflict every day on a daily basis, and it's not going to be effective for yourself in your own sanity and your ethical and moral conscience, but also the fact that it's going to run into issues operationally, as Mr. Desmond Chin and Dr. Gerard E has pointed out. So I wouldn't envy this person actually, because he is in moral predicaments every day.
Thank you. Greg, over to you.
Yes. Yeah, moral predicament, moral hazard, or even that misadventure and applied ethics. that I made reference to earlier. I think the wisdom has already been shared by Commissioner, and of course rich perspectives from practice from Dr. Gerard E. about exceptions. I would also draw attention to the Code of Governance, because the principle is that all board members of the charity should exercise independent judgment and act in the best interest of the charity. And to ensure objectivity in decision making, then it is desirable for the board to be totally independent from staff working for the charity. So that's the aspiration. Of course, it's comply or explain. In an ideal sense, it's not going to be easy for the staff involved to also chair the board. But as long as you steer clear from some of the areas that have been referred to. But what is critical is that if you do have no choice because of practicality, it's small, it's exceptional, the founder is the one with the passion, the one who is pouring in all the resources, trying to build it, it's embryonic, then keep the clear distinctions in mind that Dr. Gerard E. mentioned. Because it's important to remember that policy is separate from operations. Governance, as Abdul Hamid has told us, is separate from management. And even there, the Code of Governance makes it crystal clear that in charities where some board members may be directly involved in operational decisions and matters, a clear distinction should be made between their board role and their operational work, paragraph 1.1.5.
Thank you, Gregory. Okay, the next question is actually directed at Gregory. This is a very specific question about donation. And the question goes, do you have any advice for charities on donors defaulting on agreed upon large sum donations?
My advice is to see me offline, and then I'll open a file in my firm. Okay, let me deal with it at just some foundational points. That's a very tricky one, right? Because we depend on the largest of donors. A lot of it is goodwill. But what if you were really banking on that large sum donation and then there is a default? I think the question is it an expectation which is something you can enforce, or is it an expectation which is more like a hope? The principle of law, of course, is that if there is a gift, it can't be revoked. So some of this is, pretty fact specific. But I will be honest as well that from the point of view of the goodwill of the charity, the largest of the charity, I think if you want to maintain good relations, you also need to be mindful of your own reputation, because if you go to court, try to enforce it, what's the lingering perception of your charity? You could do it, you might have a case, and perhaps some of that which is also becoming quite regular overseas. In Australia, for example, I'm told that a few of the charities will litigate over bequests made in wills, and then there's a fight between family members and the charity. So you have to weigh the facts very carefully. Take legal advice, obviously, but even if you do have merits, I think try and understand a bit better about the reasons why that donation is not forthcoming. Maybe the situation, finances of the donor involved has changed, and so even if you sue and the person doesn't have the means, then to what end, right? You're throwing good money after bad yourself. So I'll just make those sort of observations, but it is fact specific.
Thank you. And the person who asked the question can see you offline, of course. Okay, the next question relies on the collective wisdom of our panel. The question goes, it is mentioned that governance covers a wide area of considerations. As the landscape evolves along with the capabilities of criminals, how is policy making able to keep up with the new risks like IT, AML, etc., to plug new loopholes?
Well, I think I'll quickly jump into this, because one of the new areas that we urge charities to really consider and implement is to have a process of looking at risk management. And this will cover the broader topic, and really charities for its sustainability ought to ponder on what are the risks they're facing that could jeopardize their sustainability. And this will apply across the board, including your operations, including losing some of your key personnel, including not having the proper processes to protect your data, your IT system, including, very importantly, the lack of succession planning. And when some of your key board members are incapacitated, you are really left high and dry. It covers the whole gamut. And because of that, you really need to put into place a process for enterprise risk management. If you go into the Charities Council, the KPMG has helped us to come up with a framework to get you started into looking into the risk management. But it is a journey, it's ongoing, and seek help, because most charity, I'm very sure, do not have the internal capability of going through an exercise of looking at risk management. And there are a lot of experts out there who are willing to do it, well, I won't say pro bono, but at very low fees to help the charities as well.
Thank you, Dr. Yee. Mr. Hamid, I think you want to make a point.
No, I just want to make sure, even you don't have an enterprise risk management framework in place, it is the duty of every board member or the board collectively to ensure the adequacy and effectiveness of internal controls in place. And this is a topic that we've been talking about from time to time, the importance for the board to set the right tone from the top. And even auditors have been talking about it also, how important it is to ensure to safeguard your assets, ensure that the internal controls are well in place. So I think this should be something that needs to be improved, continuing, because I believe the topic of internal controls is something that has to be talked about often. Yeah, that's in relation to your financial risk and the questions about criminals. And then there's need to be a lot of awareness, whether you have really a fraud management program, awareness program, and so forth in place to manage it.
Yep, thank you.
Oh, I have something.
Yes.
Sorry, I have something to add on to risk management. Just in case people think that it is just looking at the present and what is happening. Actually, risk management also helps organization to be forward-looking, because in part of considering the risks, you have to look at what are the possible changes in terms of legislations, of rules, what are the possible changes in terms of the scenario out there that will affect how you go about doing your things, your operations. And therefore, it helps you to anticipate and put into place the changes on a timely basis. So it is also forward-looking and not just looking at the present.
Yep. Thank you. Shall I move on to the next question? We have a lot of questions to tackle. We may not be able to cover all of them. Yeah, there is a related question on what we just talked about, risk management, because that is a practice, or that is part and parcel of a governance practice. And this is related to the governance, the cost of governance. So this question says, what is the recommended, if there is such a thing, a recommended governance cost against the annual expenses, governance costs such as referring to the external audit costs, internal audit costs, policy review, and so on and so forth?
No,
is there a recommendation?
No, I don't think you can segregate it. The governance is all part and parcel of your operational processes. So audit is a must to make sure that nothing has gone wrong. And if you have a good auditor, the auditor will also advise you how to improve on your controls and not just look at past results. So governance cost is actually not a cost as some people see it, like because it's legislated, so I have no choice, I have to spend that sort of money. Actually, governance cost is an investment into how you can improve and be a better organization, a stronger organization, and more importantly, how it affects your sustainability. Because when something goes wrong, there's always the risk that organization can collapse. And you have seen some very high-profile cases where governance went horribly wrong and the organization had to be rescued. So it's not a a cause to be seen as if I can't help it. You know, if I don't pay the license fee, I can't operate. It's not that sort of cost. Actually, it is an investment into how you can be a stronger organization.
Maybe I just need to what Jared said.
In fact, I think Jared, governance shouldn't be looked at something that is very separate from what you do in terms of the processes. Whenever you do, you always take into account the governance perspective, and it's something that is embedded in the process. When you make decisions, you always consider what are the governance issues. So to take it as something like separate exercise, it's not something I would actually approach. It should be something integral, embedded in your day-to-day running of your processes.
I just want to guess the person who raised the question, whether he or she was thinking of the administrative cost, having the staff to fill up the questionnaires or the compliance, the transparency rule. Is he thinking about that rather than what I've just said, that is all part and parcel of an investment into your organization? And that goes back to my earlier statement about investment in your backroom, the ability of your organization to keep good records and so forth. So an analogy is people always complain to me that it's so much work to prepare annual report because you have to recollect, gather all the old photographs of events. And my answer is very simple. As and when on a progressive basis, when you have an event, we've done something, just journalize it, keep the photograph. At the end of the year, it's a matter of collating what you already have, and that's your annual report. And it will give a good summary of what you have done during the year. So it's no extra burden if you do it in a proper, organized manner.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. E. Yes, Desmond, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd just like to add something more generically to the question behind the question. Yeah, just some. So we've been talking about hiring of people, the cost of governance, and so on and so forth. So just a quick story. I met somebody whom I served on a cooperative some years back. Reached out and said that she wanted to speak to me, and because of a charity that she happened to be in, and she wanted some advice. So I met her for breakfast, and after 15 minutes of her talking, I realized she became the president of the charity. So I asked her, "You became the president of charity already?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Do you know what you got yourself into?" She said, "Yes. That's why I'm calling you to ask you some questions on how to sort out some issues." So there's issues with the constitution, with board members, with governance issues, with the way in which financial statements are being prepared, and also a weak executive team. So we spent an hour, and I think I listened for 55 minutes of a conversation, and I realized that I think running a charity is like running any other organization. You have fiduciary responsibilities, you have board responsibilities, and it's a serious matter. And I think for whether or not we hire the right staff is as important for the charity sector as it is in any other listed company or any other organization we're in. So we need to pay attention to it. So whether or not you stint on a good accountant or auditor, my suggestion is please don't do that. All the charities have a certain responsibility, and if you want to be in a charity sector, then you need to put the necessary investments of time, effort, and money in running the charity well. For one simple reason is that, number one, you have beneficiaries whom you serve, who are dependent on us when we run the charity. And number two, we are using public donation money. If it's your own money, it's fine. You can do what you want with it. But if it's a public money, then we have a responsibility to steward it well. So we need to use some common sense and understand where our responsibilities are, so that when we make certain decisions, ethical or otherwise, just make sure it's correct and ethically correct. Thank you.
Thank you. We are about just 1 minute away to closing this webinar, and I thought it is there are actually still a lot of questions that we haven't covered. I thought I just wanted to cover one very important question, and please pardon me because I think this is important to many charities, and it's got to do with costs, about how we steward costs. Now, these questions pertain to manpower costs, and it says that today, is it still an accepted norm or an expectation that for an equivalent job scope, staff in charity should expect to be remunerated less than the marketplace because it is a charity and non-profit making? I see Dr. Yi shaking his head, so you will have the honor to answer first.
Oh, I think people need to understand what a charity is. A charity, you know, we exist to help people. And is there any logical reason why someone who wants to work with you to help people, they themselves must make the sacrifice? You know, I mean, it is the model of a charity, and I think where it goes wrong is a legacy issue. In the early days, charities exist to provide shelter, food, security for people, and that's about it. Now the government take good care of it, but we still continue with that mindset. When we form a charity, it says to help someone, children afflicted with autism. For some strange reason, everyone in their mind frame thinks, oh, we are only going to service children from families who are poor, and we can only charge them X dollars, and that's all the money we have. So we can only afford a half qualified staff, or don't get the full complement of things. Actually, it should not be. It should be, what are the sort of professionals I need to hire? What does it cost me? Get the proper costing, and that's what I should charge in order to have an effective program produces the right outcome. Having said that, at the tail end, you then say no one should be deprived of access to the program because they are poor. So charity comes at the end, where I raise money to subsidize the cost so that every family who needs this service can afford it, irrespective of their financial means. But we always design charities at the front end thinking of a lack of income, thinking of only servicing those who can't afford. So now we have a dilemma. I know some elderly person who have a house who's very happy to sell it off and move into a nursing home, only to be rejected because she's not poor. There's something wrong with the whole philosophy behind it, and I think we need to really look into it and say we exist to provide a service, and as a charity, we make sure no one is deprived of access to this service. The charity part or element comes at the tail end. Only then can we professionalize ourselves and ensure we provide better services and better outcomes.
Well said. Thank you, Dr. Yi. And can we hear from the rest of the panelists on the same question about remunerating staff at market rate?
So perhaps I'll
I know
just,
Jennifer has, yeah, okay, great. Yes, go ahead.
I keep interrupting Jennifer. So Jennifer, first again.
Greg, why don't you go first? Yeah, yes, for the last question, you go first.
For the last question.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I echo what Dr. Yi has said, and I think we need to have a, fundamental paradigm shift in terms of our outlook. I like the phrase that is being used now for charities and IPC, social service agencies. And I think, there is, I think, good reason. I think for too long, and I think the legacy issues have been already surfaced by Dr. Yi, but for too long, I think this idea of non-profit equals to non-profitable equals to, those who cannot make it in the commercial world, then, join this sector. I think that thinking is really antiquated. And today's scale, today's sophistication in terms of the outreach, the expectations of internal, external stakeholders, of beneficiaries, the complexity of those needs, and the level of skilled expertise that you need to bear, to bring to bear on these matters requires very good people. Of course, you want people with good hearts and good minds, and people who are passionate about the cause, where it isn't just about the the trappings of that role or even about the remuneration. But I do think there needs to be that shift. And part of it, I think, calls to mind analysis about the value proposition of that staff. How much bang for the buck will they be able to have? Are they having a catalytic influence? What's the ratio of, say, social worker to beneficiaries, counselor to beneficiaries? How many lives are being impacted? And, in turn, when you look at that, you look at it, even their family members of those beneficiaries in some cases. And then I think when you look at it from the point of view of impact and outcome, then you can measure the true value of that particular staff. And then you're not just focused on the cost proposition, you're really looking at the value proposition. And the ideal would be that if we can marry the best of the staff with also building the corpus of volunteers, so that you can have the best of both worlds. But I really appreciate that a lot of this, the lie of the land will be very different for different charities, the mix, the kind of solutions. But I completely agree that we should rethink this question from fundamentals.
Thank you, Greg. And one of Desmond, Mr. Hamid, or Jennifer, either one of you, we'll take turns. Ladies first.
Sure, I have a very short answer to it, which is back to duty-based ethics. I think we should not treat anybody as a means to any kind of ends, right? So your staff especially are not means to your ends. Just like we don't treat donors as means to our ends, we don't treat staff as means towards our ends. So short and sweet, as a duty-based ethicist, I think that's a very straightforward answer. On a utilitarian perspective as well, right? Greatest good for the greatest benefit. I think you need happy staff, well-paid staff for their value in order to achieve, bigger impact on your behalf of your organization. So from a utilitarian perspective, from a duty-based perspective, I think we'll arrive at the same conclusion on how you should be paying your staff. Short and sweet. Thank you.
Well, I just like to very pay them at as near the market rate as possible. The charity sector has always this perceived, so long as you're in the charity sector, you must be paid less than those in the private sector. I think you need to close the gap. We are providing service just as important as those in the profit sector. And I think it's all a question of changing the mindset of those people. That what Dr. Gregory has mentioned today, things have changed. And in fact, we need to do more, better known as the social service agencies. Perhaps we should drop the term charitable organizations.
Yes.
And make use more frequently this notion of a social service agencies frequently.
Yes. Yep. Thank you. Yeah. And Commissioner, you have the honor to wrap up this question for us.
I don't know if many of you know, but my background is in social work, and I studied as a social worker in the US. 30 years ago, I graduated, which was in 1990. I did not go into the social work field for one very simple reason. The social service sector was poorly paid at the time, and I couldn't even pay for my study loan, let alone feed my family if I were to work in the social service sector. So painful as it was, I had to take a practical decision. I didn't join an SSA, or what we call today. Instead, I went to prisons. Yeah, and I ended up there for 30 years. Well, I'm so happy whenever there's a announcement of salary revisions in the social service sector, and then now I think our social workers are paid a lot more decently than they were 30 years back. So if you ask me this question, for goodness sake, please pay a fair wage. I'm not asking, I don't think we should be paying exorbitant wages, but pay a fair and reasonable wage so that the people who are working in the charity sector can continue to do what they love doing and do it well without having to worry about bringing the food to the table. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for the discussion and taking all the questions from the panelists. It's been an enjoyable session, at least for me, and I trust it has been for you too. We have come to the end of the webinar, and due to time constraints, we have not been able to answer all of your questions, but I know that our colleagues at Charities Unit will try their best to follow up with an email to answer the questions that we are unable to cover at today's webinar. Now, on your screen, you will see a QR code. Please scan the QR code that is on there and help us complete the feedback form. We will send you a follow-up email and use that link in the email to also access the feedback form. In addition, in the email will also include the presentation slides and the rest of the handouts from today's webinar. So please look out for the email. So once more, I trust this has been an insightful and rewarding afternoon for all of you at In Conversation with Commissioner of Charities and Charity Unit. We hope to see you soon. Take care and stay safe. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Take care.